So in Act 1, the protagonist has this status quo that enables them to have a behavior, and they're going to be forced to change this behavior over the course of their arc, over the course of the plot. By the end of Act 1, the protag loses that status quo. The other characters, the setting, their own internal conflict is forcing them to go outside of their comfort zone, and they can't get back. Act 2 is about how the protagonist copes with losing this status quo. And Act 2 is really, really long. It's supposed to be 50% of the story. Act 1 is 25%, Act 2 is 50%, Act 3 is 25%. How will you fill the vast tundra of the second act? In creating character arcs, K.M. Weiland recommends taking the second act and splitting it into 2 smaller acts. She says that in the first half of Act 2, the character is just reacting to the circumstances around them. And then the midpoint happens, and in the second half of Act 2, the character becomes proactive. So let's go through the major scenes and sequences of Act 2. In the Act 1 closer, the protagonist lost their status quo. So sequence 3, the next couple of scenes, is about the protagonist's immediate reaction to losing the status quo. Even if they didn't love the way things were, they haven't achieved their objective yet, they haven't arced yet, they haven't figured stuff out. They're in a state of chaos. So they have to grieve the loss of the old status quo. And sequence 3 is the first stage of that grief. They try to keep behaving the way that they always behave, and it's just not being accepted. They can't get away with it anymore. The easy solutions are not working. They are struggling in this new status quo. So you write 3 to 5 scenes about that. That brings us to sequence 4. And by sequence 4, usually the character understands on some level that they need to try to change. So it's their first attempts to change. But changing a behavior, a belief, a thought, a feeling, that's really, really tough for people to do. So sequence 4 is usually about trial and error, but mostly error. So you write 3 to 5 scenes of the protagonist getting knocked around, because even though they're trying to embrace things the new way, they're still grieving the old status quo. They're still connected to the old way. That's still their muscle memory. And at the end of sequence 4, we have a major scene, the midpoint. Often in the midpoint, the protagonist has been kicked around long enough, they have failed long enough that they start to notice the pattern. They start to figure out what they've been doing wrong and or what they should be doing instead. They make a meaningful step forward. They figure out how to start exorcising the ghost of their old status quo.